Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast graciously donated by Podbean.com. Thanks, Podbean. Today on the Hauger History Podcast, we spotlight someone who turned the spotlight on others that did not have a voice for themselves, Dorothea Lynde Dix and the first generation of American mental asylums. Today on the Hauger History Podcast. Hello and welcome to a special edition of the 8th grade Hauger History Podcast with Mr. Hauger. I am the second part. February 1st, 2017 is the date at which I sit down on this desk, the day before Groundhog's Day, and you'll see if you see my shadow in this podcast as we talk about one of the great reformers of the 19th century and one of the great Americans in history, Dorothea Lynde Dix. Reform movements were happening all over the country during the 1800s. Abolitionism and the movement to end slavery, temperance in the churches trying to outlaw drinking and prohibition of alcohol, voter reforms to get people into the ballot box to give them the rights that were outlined in the Constitution. Well, after returning to America in 1840, Dorothea Lynde Dix conducted a statewide investigation of how the insane and how the poor and how the mentally disabled were being treated in Massachusetts. In most cases, things were not good. In fact, the situation was very grim. In a lot of situations in these towns, local individuals had to care for all of the mentally ill people who could not care for themselves. People that didn't have family or friends to do so were in many cases just out of luck. These situations were unregulated, unregistered, unrecognized, and underfunded. And the system also resulted in widespread abuse, which, as we know, is a terrible thing whenever we talk about the parts of our population anywhere in the world that cannot defend themselves. Dix published these reports, and she did widespread research. And one of the things I really respect about her is that she took a situation that was so horrible, and instead of crying out and demanding change without evidence, she went and collected the reports herself. She titled it a memorial. She gave it to the state legislator and said, quote, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, stalls, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." That is a heavy and heartfelt statement, and a difficult one to read as much as it would have been to hear. And her lobbying directly resulted in a bill to expand the state's mental hospital. In 1844, she continued. She visited all of the counties, the jails, the almshouses around New Jersey in a very similar investigation to what she reported on in Massachusetts, and found a lot of the same things. She prepared another memorial. She gave it to the New Jersey legislature, gave a detailed account of all of her observations, her records, her details, and the facts that she observed. And she urgently appealed to the legislature to act and appropriate funds. She told them how necessary it was for a facility to be built to dedicate to care and treat these people. And she cited a number of cases to emphasize the importance of the state taking responsibility for this class of unfortunate citizens that did not have a voice or a representative for themselves. She wrote so many accounts that are just heartbreaking. Her detailed and ability of skillful writing to discuss this one person, saying, quote, "This feeble and depressed old man, helpless, lonely, and yet conscious of surrounding circumstances and not now wholly oblivious to the past. This feeble old man, who was he?" And many of the legislators knew who she was talking about. It was Joseph S. Dodd. And she introduced him to the Senate. She also introduced a resolution to authorize an asylum, the first that our country would see, that was passed the following day. And the first committee made their report February 25th, which is why I thought February would be a good month to release this podcast. She appealed to the New Jersey legislature to act at once. And some politicians opposed, but they really had to oppose it secretly because they knew that taxes would be necessary to support it, and we were not that far off from revolutions over such taxes. And it was concerning to some people in the legislature, but she continued to lobby for her facility. She knew how important it was. She wrote letters. She wrote editorials in the newspapers. She met with legislators and held group meetings in the evenings at her own home. And this act was taken up on March 14th, 1845, and read for the last time. On March 25th, the bill was passed for the establishment of a state facility. There's something wonderful about Dorothea Dix and the way she went about her work. Scientifically, statistically, with written records, but with heart, passion, drive, and all of the willingness to lobby herself to meet with these people, to organize these meetings, to submit report after report. She would eventually get a hospital opened in Raleigh in North Carolina in 1846. She also helped other hospitals open up similar mental asylums to care for the mentally ill. I also thought it was great she didn't just stop in her hometown, but she went state to state. She went to Piedmont. She went to Pennsylvania. She went to Morganton, North Carolina. She went back to Europe and recommended that Scotland and other agencies in different countries also proposed legislation to get these things passed. Nova Scotia. She had literally traveled a quarter of the world to see her mission and her campaign give more services to people in need. During the Civil War, she didn't sit at home. She went with the Union Army and became superintendent of Army nurses. She and others found that the qualities that made her a successful crusader in politics were not as effective in managing a large organization, but nevertheless, she had an impact on setting guidelines for nurse candidates. Even though she was at odds with doctors and feuded with them over the control of medical facilities, she was eventually relieved of her responsibility, but her influence set up what would later be exceeded and innovated and adapted by Dr. Mary Walker and Clara Barton. So even though she resigned in August of 1865, she lived a meaningful post-war life and also transitioned to help care of prisoners and the disabled and more of the mentally ill. And she helped a lot of prisons and asylums in the South become improved, and she got more legislature and bills passed in Massachusetts and other states to help honor those who did not have a voice and who were not being represented by their constituents and by their elected officials. So Dorothea Lynde Dix is someone to really look into more in terms of women's history, in terms of American history, and in terms of human history. Someone who stood up for people that didn't have a voice, were marginalized, and who were being mistreated quietly in the corner. Not a lot of room for humor there. It's a serious podcast and a serious person who made a serious difference. Well, that's it for me for today. For an 8th grade edition, go ahead and push in your chairs. And I hope you found this podcast interesting. You can follow us on Twitter at Hauger History, Hauger, or follow Danny Hauger. Subscribe on YouTube. We hope that you enjoy it and you can request your own episodes as well. We'll talk to you next time on the Hauger History Podcast.